hospital staff frequently dismissed Josephine Campbell as a liability. To them, she was merely a brittle, trembling relic who belonged in a quiet nursing home, not the chaos of a level 1 trauma center. Yet when the double doors suddenly blew open and tragedy spilled into the ER, they finally witnessed the terrifying truth. The frailest woman in the room was the only one who had survived a war. Josephine Campbell was 74 years old, and she was entirely used to being invisible. To the young adrenaline-fueled doctors and nurses buzzing through the corridors of San Diego Coastal Medical Center, Josephine was little more than a piece of vintage hospital furniture. She was a volunteer triage assistant now, though she still wore her faded blue scrubs. She walked with a pronounced heavy limp, her left leg dragging just a fraction of an inch behind her right. Her hands mapped with prominent blue veins and age spots carried a permanent subtle tremor. "She's a massive liability, Harrison," Dr. Philip Carter hissed, aggressively sanitizing his hands outside Trauma Bay 3. Carter was 31, wore his stethoscope like a Medal of Honor, and possessed the kind of arrogance that only came from a freshly printed Ivy League medical degree. "I'm telling you she's going to drop a tray or mix up a chart or trip over a crash cart. We are a level 1 trauma center, not an assisted living facility." Harrison Gould, the hospital administrator, sighed and pinched the bridge of his nose. "Dr. Carter Josephine has been affiliated with this hospital for over 40 years. She mostly just hands out blankets talks to the terrified families and helps with basic triage. She's harmless. Plus, the union would have a field day if we unceremoniously dumped her. She's frail." Carter snapped, his voice carrying down the hall, just enough for Josephine to hear as she restocked the linen closet. "She took 5 minutes to open a sterile saline bottle yesterday because her hands were shaking so badly. It's embarrassing." Inside the linen closet, Josephine paused. Her trembling fingers tightened around a stack of pristine white towels. She didn't cry. She didn't feel the sting of insulted pride. When you have lived through the things Josephine had lived through, the petty complaints of a sleep-deprived civilian doctor, registered as nothing more than a mosquito bite, she carefully placed the towels on the shelf, her breathing steady and calm. She remembered a time when her hands didn't shake. She remembered when those same hands were slick to the elbows with crimson, working frantically under the blinding strobe of mortar flashes. It was 1968, Phu Bai Combat Base, Vietnam, the 3rd Medical Battalion. Josephine closed her eyes, and the sterile smell of the hospital bleach faded, replaced instantly by the suffocating scent of diesel fuel, vaporized mud, and copper. She was 22 years old, again, a combat nurse dropped into the meat grinder of the Tet Offensive. They hadn't called her Frail back then. They called her the Angel of Route 1. Josephine, the sharp voice shattered her memory. Josephine blinked, turning slowly to see Nurse Amanda Jenkins standing in the doorway looking impatient. "Dr. Carter needs Trauma Bay 1 prepped for an incoming lac repair. Nothing major, just a civilian who slipped with a kitchen knife. But he wants it done 5 minutes ago," Amanda said, not unkindly, but with the rushed dismissiveness reserved for the elderly. "Can you handle that? Or do you want me to get one of the techs?" "I can handle it, dear," Josephine said, her voice a quiet, raspy hum. She shuffled out of the closet and made her way to Bay 1. As she reached up to adjust the overhead surgical light, the loose fabric of her scrub top slipped slightly, exposing her collarbone and the top of her right shoulder. A jagged, hideous topography of scarred flesh peeked out from beneath the cotton. It was a massive starburst keloid, the unmistakable calling card of an AK-47 round that had shattered her clavicle and torn through her trapezius muscle. Beneath it, running down her back, were the scattered silver craters of shrapnel. She quickly pulled her collar up, ensuring the armor of her scrubs remained intact. No one in this hospital knew about the scars. No one knew about her silver star locked away in a dusty cedar box in her apartment. To them, she was just old Josephine. Slow, trembling, frail Josephine. Later that afternoon, the ER settled into a rare, eerie quiet. Dr. Carter was leaning against the nurse's station, sipping a lukewarm coffee and complaining about his golf swing to a resident. Josephine sat quietly in a corner chair, systematically folding pediatric gowns. "I'm telling you, if I can just fix my hip rotation, I'll drop 3 strokes," Carter was saying, demonstrating a mock swing with his clipboard. Josephine didn't look up. Her instincts honed 50 years ago in a jungle 10,000 miles away were suddenly screaming. It was the same feeling she used to get right before the sirens wailed at Khe Sanh. A sudden drop in air pressure, a prickling at the base of the skull, the quiet before the storm. Suddenly, the red emergency phone on the wall behind the nurse's station began to blare. It wasn't the standard ring. It was the mass casualty alarm. Amanda snatched the receiver. Her face went completely pale. "What? How many say that again?" She dropped the phone, her eyes wide with panic. "Pile up on the I-5. A commercial semi-truck blew a tire and plowed into a military transport convoy from Camp Pendleton. We have at least 15 criticals incoming. ETA is 2 minutes. Carter dropped his clipboard. The color drained from his face. 15 criticals. We only have 3 trauma surgeons on call. They're bypassing the other hospitals. We're the closest level 1, Amanda shouted, already running toward the supply cabinets. Clear the bays, move all non-criticals to the hallway. Carter began shouting, his voice pitching high with panic. I need blood. Get the blood bank down here. O negative, as much as they have. Josephine stood up. She didn't drop the gown she was folding. She placed it neatly on the chair. The trembling in her hands stopped completely. Her spine straightened, erasing decades of gravity and arthritis in a single second. The frail old woman vanished, replaced by First Lieutenant Campbell of the United States Army Nurse Corps. Through the glass doors of the ambulance bay, the flashing red and blue lights began to multiply, painting the white walls of the ER in a frantic, terrifying strobe. The war had come back, and Josephine was ready. The double doors of the ER blew open with a violent crash. Paramedics poured in like a dam, shoving blood-soaked gurneys over the linoleum. The sterile silence of the hospital was instantly pulverized by a cacophony of agony, screaming metal-torn victims, shouting medics, and the relentless panicked beeping of heart monitors flatlining. Blunt force trauma to the chest, tension, pneumothorax, BP is plummeting, a paramedic yelled, wheeling in a young man in a shredded military utility uniform. Put him in Bay 1, Carter screamed, running alongside the gurney. He was sweating profusely, his eyes darting frantically around the overwhelmed room. Amanda, I need a chest tube tray now. Where is Dr. Evans? Evans is in the OR. He can't come down, Amanda cried out, struggling to untangle an IV line. More stretchers flooded in, young faces pale and slick with sweat and blood. Soldiers. Josephine walked calmly through the chaos. She didn't run. Running caused panic. In a mass casualty, Event smooth is fast, and fast is smooth. She approached Trauma Bay 2. A young Marine no older than 19 was thrashing on the bed. His right leg was crushed, but that wasn't what was killing him. A massive piece of jagged metal from the truck's chassis was embedded deep in his brachial artery near his armpit. Bright, frothy red blood was pumping rhythmically onto the floor. A terrified young resident was standing over him, frozen in shock. I can't get a clamp on it. It's too deep. He's bleeding out. Move. The resident blinked, startled by the harsh, commanding bark. It hadn't come from an attending physician. It had come from Josephine. "Josephine, step back," Dr. Carter yelled from across the room, his hands covered in blood from the chest tube he was butchering in Bay 1. "You can't be in here. You're a liability." Josephine ignored him. She stepped up to the gurney. The young Marine was going into hypovolemic shock, his eyes rolling back in his head. "Stay with me, son," Josephine murmured, her voice entirely devoid of the frail rasp it usually carried. It was a voice forged in artillery fire. She didn't reach for a clamp. She knew from the spray pattern that the artery was completely severed and retracting into the muscle tissue. A surgical clamp wouldn't catch it in time. Without hesitating, Josephine thrust her bare, ungloved hand directly into the ragged, torn flesh of the Marine's armpit. "What the hell are you doing?" Carter screamed, abandoning his patient for a second to run toward her. "I'm finding the bleeder," Josephine said coldly, her fingers digging deep into the boy's muscle, searching blindly by feel. The young resident watched in absolute horror. Josephine's face was a mask of pure, terrifying concentration. There, her index and middle fingers found the slick, pulsing, rubbery tube of the severed artery. She pinched it shut with a brutal vice-like grip. Instantly, the geyser of blood stopped. "Got it," Josephine said, breathing evenly. She didn't look at Carter, who was now standing beside the bed, his jaw slack with shock. "Doctor, I have the artery manually occluded. I need a vascular clamp, 2 silk sutures, and you need to push 2 units of O negative right now or he's going to code." Carter stared at her. He wasn't looking at an elderly volunteer anymore. He was looking at a machine. I do it, Doctor!" Josephine roared a terrifying guttural command that snapped Carter out of his paralysis. "Clamp! Give her a clamp!" Carter yelled at the resident. For the next 45 minutes, Josephine Campbell commanded the emergency room. She moved from bed to bed, her pronounced limp completely forgotten. She packed wounds, barked out fluid ratios, and recognized signs of internal bleeding that the computerized monitors hadn't even caught yet. When an airway collapsed in Bay 4, it was Josephine who snatched a scalpel and performed a flawless blind cricothyrotomy in under 10 seconds, saving a suffocating soldier's life, while 2 senior surgeons watched in stunned silence. During the frantic resuscitation of a crushed chest in Bay 3, the young soldier seized violently. His arm flailed out, catching the collar of Josephine's scrub top and tearing it downward with a sharp rip of fabric. The entire right side of her collar and shoulder was exposed. The bright fluorescent lights illuminated the massive jagged scars, the bullet wound, the shrapnel craters, the undeniable map of combat survival carved into her flesh. Amanda gasped, covering her mouth as she saw the mangled tissue. Dr. Carter stared at the scars, his face flushing crimson with a sudden crushing wave of shame. He had called her weak. He had called her a liability. Pack that shoulder with combat gauze and apply pressure." Josephine ordered, completely unfazed by her torn shirt. She didn't even bother to cover the scars. There was no time for modesty. There was only the mission. Finally, the chaos began to subside. The critical patients were stabilized and being wheeled up to the surgical suites. The floor of the ER was painted in horrific abstract streaks of red. The metallic smell hung heavy in the air. Josephine stood by the sinks, breathing heavily. The adrenaline was leaving her body, and the familiar ache in her joints was slowly returning. She turned the faucet on and began scrubbing the dried blood from her hands and forearms. Dr. Carter approached her slowly. He looked like a man who had just been hit by a train. "Josephine, He couldn't find the words. He stared at the starburst scar on her shoulder, his arrogance entirely shattered. "Where did you learn to do a blind cricothyrotomy?" Before she could answer, the automatic doors of the ER slid open once more. Heavy synchronized boot steps echoed across the tile floor. The remaining medical staff turned around. Walking into the ER was a squad of 6 men. They weren't paramedics and they weren't highway patrol. They were clad in desert digital camouflage tactical vests and heavy boots. At their helm was a towering, broad-shouldered man with a square jaw and a grim expression. The insignia on his collar flashed under the lights. It was a Navy SEAL team, specifically the Elite Quick Reaction Force from the nearby Naval Amphibious Base, sent to secure the classified equipment from the crashed transport convoy. The hospital administrator, Harrison Gould, rushed forward, flanked by security. "Gentlemen, please, you can't be in here. The injured personnel are being taken to surgery." The SEAL commander, Captain William Bull McIntyre, didn't even look at Gould. He raised a massive hand, instantly silencing the administrator. McIntyre's eyes swept the room, taking in the blood, the exhausted doctors, and the triage bays. Then his eyes locked onto the sinks. He saw the elderly woman in the torn scrubs. He saw the way she stood, exhausted but unbowed. And then he saw the horrific, unmistakable battle scars on her exposed shoulder. McIntyre's breath hitched. He stepped past the doctors, past the administrator, and walked straight toward the washing station. The 5 SEALs behind him followed in perfect, silent unison. The entire emergency room went dead silent. Dr. Carter stepped back, intimidated by the sheer physical presence of the operators. McIntyre stopped 3 feet away from Josephine. He looked at her frail, trembling hands now washed clean. He looked at the silver star scar on her clavicle. "Excuse me, ma'am." McIntyre's deep, gravelly voice echoed in the quiet ER. "Are you Josephine Campbell?" Josephine reached up with a wet hand and slowly pulled her torn scrub collar back over her shoulder. She looked the giant Navy SEAL dead in the eye. "I am," she said quietly. The silence in the emergency room was absolute. The frantic symphony of cardiac monitors, hissing oxygen valves, and chaotic shouting had completely evaporated, replaced by a heavy, suffocating stillness. Everyone, the nurses, the surviving paramedics, the blood-soaked residents, and Dr. Philip Carter stared at the bizarre tableau unfolding by the scrub sinks. 6 heavily armed Navy SEALs men who looked like they were carved out of granite and violence were standing in a rigid deferential semicircle around an elderly 74-year-old hospital volunteer. Captain William Bull McIntyre took another step forward. He was a giant of a man standing 6'4", his desert camouflage uniform stained with the dust of the coastal highway crash. He looked down at Josephine Campbell, his eyes scanning the faded blue cotton of her scrubs, the deep wrinkles around her eyes, and the slight involuntary tremor that had returned to her hands now that the adrenaline was fading. First Lieutenant Josephine Campbell. McIntyre said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a weight that sent a shiver down the spine of everyone listening. United States Army Nurse Corps, attached to the 3rd Medical Battalion during the Tet Offensive. Josephine did not flinch. She simply nodded slowly. That was a very long time ago, Captain. I am just a triage volunteer now. With all due respect, ma'am. McIntyre replied, his jaw tightening. You are much more than that. Your actions are literally required reading at the Naval Special Warfare Medical Training Center at Fort Sam Houston. Dr. Carter stepped forward, his confusion overriding his profound intimidation. Wait, what are you talking about? Required reading? Josephine just hands out blankets. McIntyre slowly turned his head to look at the young, arrogant trauma surgeon. The SEAL's eyes were cold, flat, and entirely unamused. He looked Carter up and down, taking in the doctor's pristine shoes and the blood on his hands that belonged to patients Josephine had essentially saved. Dr. McIntyre said, his tone dripping with a quiet, dangerous authority. Do you have any idea who is standing in front of you? Carter swallowed hard, glancing at Josephine, then back to the SEAL commander. She's Josephine. She's been a volunteer here for 40 years. She has a limp. She has a tremor. That limp, McIntyre barked, his voice echoing sharply off the sterile tile walls, is from a piece of Soviet-made mortar shrapnel that embedded itself in her sciatic nerve. And that tremor is the result of holding a manual thoracic clamp on a bleeding soldier for 6 straight hours while her own camp was being overrun by North Vietnamese Army regulars. A collective gasp echoed from the nurse's station. Amanda dropped a clipboard, the plastic clattering loudly against the floor. McIntyre turned his attention back to the room, projecting his voice so every single medical professional in the trauma center could hear the unvarnished truth. He was no longer just a naval officer. He was a historian delivering a eulogy for the living. On the night of February 8th, 1968, the triage hospital at Phu Bai Combat Base was subjected to a sustained massive artillery barrage. McIntyre recited the details etched flawlessly into his memory. The primary surgical bunker took a direct hit. The commanding medical officers were killed instantly. The power generators were blown to pieces. The base was plunging into total darkness, and the perimeter was actively being breached. McIntyre took a breath, his chest expanding against his tactical vest. First Lieutenant Campbell was the only surviving senior medical officer. She had already been shot in the shoulder by a sniper, the scar you all just saw. Her clavicle was shattered. But instead of boarding the medical evacuation chopper, she refused to abandon the 40 critically wounded Marines in the secondary triage tent. Carter's face went completely pale. He looked at Josephine. She was looking down at her hands, her expression unreadable, entirely detached from the mythical hero McIntyre was describing. For 32 hours, McIntyre continued, his voice echoing with profound reverence. Lieutenant Campbell operated in pitch darkness, using only the illumination of incoming mortar flashes and a dying flashlight held in her teeth. She performed blind cricothyrotomies. She manually clamped severed arteries. She triaged, stabilized, and defended her patients. To emphasize the sheer impossibility of her actions, McIntyre reached into his tactical vest and pulled out a small waterproof notebook. He flipped it open. We study the declassified after-action report of that night to teach our special amphibious reconnaissance corpsmen what true extreme stress medicine looks like. The survival statistics from her tent were considered medically impossible. She saved 38 men that night, McIntyre said, softly closing the notebook. 38 men who got to go home, have children, and live their lives because a 22-year-old nurse with a shattered shoulder refused to quit. She was awarded the Silver Star for gallantry, in action one of the few women in history to receive it. The ER was entirely silent. The heavy, sterile air felt thick with sudden crushing realization. One of those men, McIntyre added, his voice finally cracking, just a fraction losing its rigid military discipline, was a 19-year-old Marine corporal whose right leg had been crushed and whose brachial artery was severed. A Marine whose life was saved because Lieutenant Campbell shoved her hand into his chest and pinched his artery shut until the medevac arrived. McIntyre took off his tactical helmet. He held it under his arm. That Marine corporal was my grandfather, Jonathan McIntyre. Josephine finally looked up. Her breath caught in her throat. The stoic, unbreakable facade she had maintained for over 5 decades suddenly cracked. She looked into the broad, rugged face of the towering Navy SEAL, and for a fleeting second, she saw the terrified eyes of the young, bleeding boy she had held together in the mud of Vietnam. Jonathan, Josephine whispered, her voice trembling not from frailty, but from a profound, agonizingly beautiful wave of memory. He made it home. He made it home, ma'am. McIntyre smiled, his eyes shining with unshed tears. He became a high school history teacher. He had 3 children. He had 7 grandchildren. He passed away peacefully 2 years ago at the age of 73. But every single day of his life, he talked about the angel of Route 1. He told us that if we ever met you, we were to give you a message. Josephine's hands shook violently. She gripped the edge of the stainless steel sink to steady herself. What was the message? McIntyre straightened his spine. He said to tell you, the debt is paid, but the gratitude is eternal. The profound emotional gravity of the legendary revelation struck the silent emergency room like an invisible physical shockwave. Dr. Philip Carter staggered weakly backward, slumping heavily against the stainless steel edge of Trauma Bay 1. He felt completely and entirely ill. The crushing weight of his own extreme arrogance, his highly petty civilian complaints, and his horrific professional misjudgment crashed rapidly down upon his broad shoulders. He had foolishly called her a terrible liability. He had complained loudly about her taking too long to simply open a saline bottle. He had blindly berated her for being terribly weak here today. Carter looked down at the fresh crimson blood drying slowly on his pristine blue surgical scrubs. It was merely a tiny microscopic fraction of the terrifying horrors she had bravely worn on her own stained garments. He finally realized with a sudden, deeply sickening drop in his gut that he would never, in his entire privileged life, be half the dedicated physician or half the honorable human being that Josephine Campbell actually was. Harrison Gould, the sharply dressed hospital administrator, was openly weeping near the swinging doors. Amanda, the exhausted head nurse, firmly clamped her trembling hands over her mouth. Hot tears streamed rapidly down Amanda's completely pale face as she looked closely at the gentle elderly woman she had so very often rushed and wrongly dismissed. "Captain McIntyre," Josephine stated clearly, her voice barely rising above a highly quiet whisper, trying desperately to firmly regain her strong professional composure. She gently wiped a single stray tear from her deeply wrinkled right cheek. "You truly did not have to actively do this. I was merely doing my basic job. That is exactly what we all do here. We simply fix the deeply broken things without ever seeking any special glory." "With immense professional respect, ma'am," McIntyre replied very gently, "you successfully accomplished significantly more than your designated combat duty today." McIntyre smoothly turned his massive, highly imposing frame to directly face Dr. Carter and the remaining stunned medical staff. The bold SEAL commander's calm demeanor instantly shifted completely back to that of a highly hardened military field operator. His extremely sharp, deeply unforgiving glare firmly pinned Carter to the painted wall. "I heard the radio chatter when my heavily armed men and I quickly secured the outer perimeter outside." McIntyre said, his strong voice completely cold and deeply unforgiving now. "I heard a doctor arrogantly screaming that this highly decorated woman was merely a terrible liability. I clearly heard someone loudly ordering her to step swiftly backwards because she was somehow considered too frail to actively assist." Carter swallowed hard, his intensely dry throat burning very painfully. "Captain, I genuinely did not know. I swear to God, I simply never knew." "Ignorance is surely no valid excuse for massive, blatant disrespect, Doctor," McIntyre snapped loudly, deliberately stepping much closer to Carter. "You critically judge her advanced chronological age, and you incorrectly perceive total physical weakness and extreme dangerous vulnerability here. You directly observe her lightly shaking hands, and you foolishly assume complete medical incompetence. Let me proudly make something incredibly and perfectly crystal clear to you, and to every single breathing person standing inside this exact same hospital room right now." McIntyre firmly pointed a thick, heavily calloused index finger straight at Josephine. "Those shaking hands have successfully held far more fiercely bleeding arteries, completely closed, than you will ever physically see in your entire privileged civilian medical career. That severe limp is the brutal physical price she willingly paid to absolutely ensure brave young men never tragically died early. She absolutely does not require your pathetic pity, and she certainly never needs your deeply insulting condescension. She highly deserves your absolute, pure, and completely unwavering human reverence every single waking day going forward." Carter nodded rapidly, his very wide eyes thoroughly remorseful. "Yes, sir, you are entirely right. I am incredibly sorry." He turned quickly to Josephine, looking very closely at her, as if actually seeing her for the very first time ever. Not as some totally invisible piece of old hospital furniture, but as a mighty titan. "Josephine Lieutenant Campbell, I am profusely sorry. Please forgive my actions. I was horribly arrogant. I was a foolish boy. You heroically saved this entire emergency room today." Josephine quietly looked directly at the greatly humbled young medical doctor. She deeply warmly offered him a perfectly small, highly forgiving smile. "It is entirely all right, Dr. Carter," she finally said softly. "Always try remembering that sometimes the very oldest metal tools are faithfully forged from the absolute strongest resilient steel." McIntyre swiftly turned back toward his elite men. "Detail!" McIntyre loudly called out, his voice ringing sharply. Instantly, the 5 Navy SEALs snapped perfectly rigidly to immediate, absolute, and perfect military attention. "Present arms," McIntyre forcefully commanded. In flawlessly perfect unison, the 6 highly trained combat veterans sharply raised their right hands, boldly executing a completely perfect military salute. They proudly saluted the legendary angel of Route 1. Josephine slowly straightened her spine, completely ignoring the painful ache in her shattered clavicle. She proudly raised her own weathered right hand, perfectly returning the ultimate salute with absolute quiet dignity. "Order arms," McIntyre barked. The SEALs dropped their hands simultaneously. They turned and marched swiftly away. Josephine smiled warmly, tightly gripping her clipboard. "Let us get completely back to work now, Dr. Carter. What would you have done if you were Dr. Carter?" Sometimes the greatest heroes among us walk the quietest paths, carrying scars we cannot see. Josephine's story proves that true strength doesn't fade with age. It just waits for the moment it's needed most. If this incredible true story of sacrifice and respect gave you chills, hit that like button, share this video to honor our hidden heroes, and subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable real-life dramas.